Today we're going to be doing a semi-deep dive into the comic book lore regarding Spider-Man. We're going to be taking a look at this expensive paper, or what I refer to them as, basically freshly murdered trees. There's probably nothing more insulting for a tree than becoming a comic book. I suppose maybe becoming toilet paper, or maybe getting chopped down only to become a book about taking care of trees, maybe. Regardless, we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 Spider-Man villains of all time. I will try to include a honorables mention little section right before mentioning our top spot. We'll talk about some comic book characters that didn't quite make the list but still deserve a mention. Before you guys start smashing your keyboards with your Dorito infested fingers, just a reminder, this is a completely subjective list. It's not the end all. This is just my personal take, my personal experience from reading comic books. Let me know in the comments section how wrong I probably am. I'm very curious to see what all of you have to say. Let's jump straight into it with number 5, where we have Jackal, aka Miles Warren, who is probably one of the more well-known scientists in the Marvel comic book community. His first appearance as just Miles Warren was actually in Amazing Spider-Man 31 all the way back in 1965. And it would take about 8 years for him to finally become the Jackal. He wouldn't gain that title all the way up until Amazing Spider-Man 129 all the way back in 1973. When we first met him, he was a biochemist professor. Because of some experiments gone wrong, he actually ends up losing his entire family. He actually becomes madly obsessed with Gwen, and then after her death, he basically blames Spider-Man for her death. And this is where he really gets to flesh out and show his true capabilities. Not only is he a very methodical villain, but he's very controlling, can manipulate people very easily. But this is really where he hits his stride. He actually works on cloning different individuals. He's actually able to clone not only Gwen but eventually Peter Parker, and he eventually realizes that he is Spider-Man, so he's able to replicate basically not only Peter Parker, but he's able to, replicate Peter Parker with all of his powers. And it's thanks to him that we finally get introduced to Kane Parker, also known as Scarlet Spider, who is probably one of the more torn characters in the entire Marvel comic universe. He's mostly an anti-hero, goes back and forth between doing some sort of shady activities as well as doing some heroic work as well. But as I mentioned, he tries to manipulate a lot of different anti-heroes or villains into taking down Spider-Man, such as Scorpion, Punisher, and obviously any of his clones that he's able to create. All in all, he is definitely one of the more massively underrated Spider-Man villains probably of all time, especially since he brought us amazing clones of Spider-Man such as, Kane Parker and Ben Reilly. Most of his hardcore Spider-Man fans can only hope that we will see him in a live-action adaptation or just become more of a central character in some of the bigger comic book projects. Moving on to number 4, we're going to be looking at the villain with probably the flyest hairstyle of the list, and not just of the list, probably of the entire Marvel universe. The only other hero that I can think of that has a better style is probably He-Man and that golden helmet style haircut. But we will be looking at Dr. Octavius, another big creation from the master himself, Stan Lee. His first appearance was in Amazing Spider-Man number 3 all the way back in 1963. The Doctor had a very dark upbringing, and a lot of this was represented in the comic books very early on. He didn't necessarily have parents of the year. He had an abusive father and a mother who basically tried to manipulate him. Eventually, after graduating high school, he was able to make it into a research facility where he was working on radioactive material, which obviously something went wrong somewhere, and the Doctor, the villain himself, was born. After completely getting destroyed by Spider-Man a couple of times, he actually ends up being basically the founder to the Sinister Six, or at least the first iteration of it. Years later, he would actually become Superior Spider-Man when he was able to swap his brain reign out with Peter Parker's. He eventually became the self-proclaimed best Spider-Man, as he wasn't taking nonsense from anybody. He went around blinding people, just murdering absolutely psychopaths. So he crossed lines that Peter Parker was unwilling to, and because of it, he was able to eradicate a lot of villains. He went as far as to eventually fight the Sinister Six and defeat them. Obviously, within time, Peter Parker was able to regain his body, and Otto was able to recover that bodacious round body of his. He deserves a spot on the list just for how intertwined he is with, you know, Spider-Man's backstory and the entire lore. Not to mention, he's one of the few characters or the few villains on this list that don't really have any big-time superpowers or abilities aside from his connection to his mechanical arms and the small amount of time that he spent as Spider-Man. But as Doc Ock, or as Otto Octavius himself, he is still a very formidable foe for Spider-Man. And his film adaptation was also very well written by Sam Raimi and truly showcased how this particular villain isn't as one-dimensional as a lot of people had portrayed him for years. For number 3, we have Dr. Connors, also known as the Lizard. He made his comic book debut all the way back in Amazing Spider-Man number 6 in 1963. And probably more notably, he was the main villain in one of the previous Andrew Garfield sequels, where also Emma Stone starred as Gwen. He is another one of those massively underrated villains for a number of reasons, but primarily because he has crossed over into being a hero through certain stretches of the Spider-Man lore in the comic books. He's even gone as far as teaming up with Spider-Man. We know he lost his arm fighting for his country when he joined the army all the way back in his origin story, and since then he's become really obsessed, or he became obsessed with being able to regenerate his arm through lizard DNA. And even though he was successful, this came at a cost, obviously. But as I said, he shifted between being a villain and being a hero. There were some pretty noticeable team-ups between Spider-Man and Lizard. For example, when they fought down Iguana, which Dr. Connors accidentally created, while he continued to try to remove the lizard aspect of his being. As I mentioned before, he's one of those villains that has an incredible amount of depth, and it's one of the bigger reasons why he deserves to be on this list. Moving on to number 2, we're going to be looking at probably one of the more popular Spider-Man villain of the last few years. We recently got his live-action adaptation, which was played by Tom Hardy. He's a relatively new character compared to the rest of the villains so far on this list. His first appearance was in Amazing Spider-Man 299 in 1987. Some people may refer to his first appearance as the symbiote suit, or, you know, the black suit that Spider-Man wore 3 years prior, but personally I don't really count that as Venom. I think Venom is usually more of a life form rather than just a costume, which was basically what it was back in 1984. And even though the franchise, or the film franchise thus far, hasn't been received very well by critics, overseas it has done extremely well in terms of box office sales. And regardless of what your opinion may be, I think he is slowly starting to become a mainstay in the Sony MCU side of things. Even though it has had a number of different hosts, the main one that we know to this day has been Eddie Brock. Their relationship was a real struggle, but eventually they were able to have some chemistry and then eventually become incredibly compatible. He would mostly be considered a villain until the early 90s during the run of the Lethal Protectors, where the Life Foundation basically made him have some offspring, which included Riot, Phage, Lasher, Agony, and Scream. And Spider-Man and Venom would eventually actually team up to fight against Carnage, who was his first offspring. He has become a hero more or less over the past few years, getting his own comic book run and then having his lore kind of expanded a little bit with the inclusion of Null and many other symbiotes. Regardless, he started off incredibly dark, but slowly and methodically became one of the more well-known Marvel characters. For the number one spot, it's actually pretty straightforward. We're looking at Venom's child, or I should say his spawn, Carnage. Don't try to dig too deep into this. It's kind of weird. Venom is technically a male and he gives birth to Carnage. Yes, it's the comic books. Don't ask too many questions. It's weird. This is another semi-modern character. Cletus Cassidy was actually introduced in 1990 in Amazing Spider-Man 344, and then later Carnage the symbiote was introduced in Amazing Spider-Man 360 in 1992. Even though numerous characters have been Carnageized along the way, the perfect combination of Cletus Cassidy and Carnage has been well documented and is one of the more well-known combinations in the Marvel Universe. Cletus had a very tough upbringing and eventually became a murderer. He had an incredibly homicidal mindset, and it was only until Eddie Brock and Venom actually crossed paths and left Carnage for him that he was fully able to realize the type of evil that he was capable of. The strangeness continued as Carnage eventually gave birth to Toxin, who ended up joining forces with a former NYPD officer. Like I said, don't dive too much into the backstory. It's a little weird. There were a number of other storylines that happened in between Carnage's birth and his eventual demise, but it all came to a head with Absolute Carnage, where we saw Carnage basically return from the dead. Donny Cates was finally able to introduce some of the best symbiote characters ever, including, as I mentioned before, Null. Venom would eventually kill him, at least for the time being, with the Necro Sword. However, we're very familiar with comic books and Marvel, and the chances of Carnage staying dead for too long are incredibly slim. So there you have it. That is our list for the top Spider-Man villains of all time. As I mentioned before, this is just my personal opinion. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think. What is your all-time favorite, or maybe your top 5 favorite villains, Spider-Man villains ever? There's quite a few to choose from, so let me know in the comment section. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will see you guys in the next one.